Hello, I'm Bill Jepson, and welcome to my tour of the world wonders that I've visited over the last 50 years. I'm a retired world history and geography teacher at Hopkins and Eden Prairie High Schools, and here I was looking a little different here at 20 years old in 1975 at the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, while I was on my 6-month tour of Europe and North Africa. I was lucky to live in Athens for 4 months in Greece during my junior spring at DePauw University in Indiana. In that summer of 75, I traveled alone throughout the rest of Europe and Morocco and Egypt. Here I am in Vienna, Austria with my favorite musician, Beethoven, at his grave. And this is my passport back then with some of the city stamps that I got along the way. You can see for Paris and Algeciras, Spain, Geneva, Switzerland, and so forth. And my ever-changing itinerary of cities and dates. For our spring break while studying in Athens, we took the short flight over to Cairo, Egypt, and spent a week there and rode camels around the pyramids. Here I am just about ready for the camel to stand up and take us around the Cheops pyramid. Here are the elaborate stamps and signatures for the visa to enter their country for 10 days. And a youth hostel pass that gave me many cheap places to stay in Europe for about $10 a night. It was easy to get around with the Interrail pass that let you on any train anytime for a month for about $165. I looked it up, and today it's around $600 for a little less time. It really gave you a sense of freedom, not having a schedule, because every day many trains take you anywhere you want to go. Remember, Europe is the size of the east half of the United States, so you can go from Paris to Rome in less than a day. It's kind of like going from Minneapolis to Florida to go from London to Athens. Here is the Interrail train map of Europe, similar to the one I used. And here I am with the famous mermaid, the symbol of Copenhagen, Denmark. Never mind where my hand was when I'm 20 years old. And much later in the 2000s, I created an overseas program at PCA, Prairie Center Alternative, which was an alternative high school in Eden Prairie. And for 8 years in the 2000s, I led tours throughout Europe and China. We went with EF Tours, which arranged everything, including a bilingual guide. And every 6 students that went, the teacher goes for free. So usually I'd get 2 teachers, like here Paul and I are with our 12 students in China. At the top, bottom left is Corfu, Italy, off of Naples. And in 2005, I was lucky to have my family come over. These are my 3 sons in the Roman Colosseum. And 2001, we're in Paris, one of the earlier trips. Let's begin our chronological journey at Stonehenge, England, which dates back 5,000 years ago. Here's my photo of the prehistoric monument with its 13-foot tall stones that weigh 20 tons each. This was back in 1975 when you could walk up to them and touch them, something you can't do today. It's located in western England, not far from Salisbury. It was built with dozens of huge stones hauled from many miles away and is laid out in concentric circles facing the rising sun. For each of the world wonders we explore, I will answer the where and when questions with a slide similar to this. So it'll seem like we're jumping all over the globe, but the places we go are all in a chronological sequence. Archaeologists believe that Stonehenge was constructed in stages by the Celts between 3000 BC to 2000 BC, making them older than the Egyptian pyramids. Here's my Kodachrome slide of my first sighting of Stonehenge as I walked over the hill from Amesbury in Wiltshire, England. For 6 months, I wrote my page-a-day diary. I'm so glad that I took my mother's advice and wrote down every day of my 6-month adventure. So here's an excerpt from where I was in London, when I was in London taking the underground tube on my way to Stonehenge. Quote, "Then I tombed to Waterloo, 5 to 20 pence, depending on the distance, and missed my train but only had to wait an hour for the next one. Got to Salisbury 2 hours later, then took a bus to Amesbury and hitchhiked the 2 miles to Stonehenge, which was up on a grassy hill with 70 people walking around it." How did they build Stonehenge? With huge stones from as far as 150 miles away, without the wheel and without metal tools. They've figured that they rolled them on logs with hundreds of men pulling on ropes as they dropped them into a ditch to stand upright. And the whole was then packed securely with rubble. On the right bottom, you see timber platforms that were probably used to slowly raise the heavy lintels into position. They use long logs as levers to lift them up just a foot high onto the next log, back and forth until they were high enough that they could push the lintel onto the 2 upright stones. Stonehenge was carefully designed to align with the movements of the sun. The enormous stones were set up in the center of the site in about 2500 BC and were precisely arranged by the Druids or Celts to frame the sunrise at summer solstice and the sunset at winter solstice. Today, thousands gather every solstice to watch the sunrise as it aligns with the ancient stones. Next, let's explore the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Here I am in 1975, one of my favorite photographs, on a camel ride around the pyramids. It cost about $2 back then. Now I looked it up. It's $20 to $50 for a half an hour instead of a couple hours. The pyramids are one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world and are by far the oldest and the only one that is still in existence. I had a pretty funny beard there with my shades in those days. They are located in Giza in northern Egypt on the continent of Africa. They're actually about a half-hour bus ride from Cairo on the west side of the Nile River. Cairo is the capital, of course. The 3 pyramids were built during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, between 2600 and 2500 BC. Here are some Egyptian children asking for bakshish, which means money, outside of our bus window. She is on a burro on the left, and of course we gave them some money. Here's an aerial view and a map of the site showing the 3 pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, 3 related pharaohs for whom they were built, and the Sphinx you can see in the front. You can see their positions on this graphic illustration here. The Khufu pyramid is the oldest, started in 2560 BC. That's longer before Christ than since Christ. Think about that. In the upper left is a view of the second pyramid, Khafre. From the top of the first pyramid, Khufu, you can see a man has climbed up there. It's a very strenuous climb, and it's illegal to do that, but on YouTube there's a lot of videos of people who've snuck up there and posted the video. We also attended the nightly sound and light show, which is very interesting, and told the story of its construction. We rode our camels around the Khufu and Khafre pyramids. You mount them as they sit on the ground, so you fly forward as they get up, and so it's different than riding a horse. And then it's very bouncy. Here's a shaky photograph I took of my friends on camels as they face backwards. And in this photo I took, you get the sense of the scale of the Great Pyramid, which is 480 feet high, almost the height of the IDS Tower in Minneapolis, with 750 feet width on each side. It's like a downtown block. It's a masterpiece of technical skill and engineering, with approximately 2 million blocks of stone weighing from 2 to 30 tons each. Each one was cut and transported from miles away up the Nile River, and assembled here to create these 5 million ton structures. We climbed about 60 feet up to this entrance on the Great Pyramid, Khufu. And from the entrance, you go down this sloping corridor which descends through the pyramid's interior masonry. Then up to an ascending passage that leads to a room known as the Queen's Chamber first, and then up to this great slanting gallery. At the upper end of this gallery is a long and narrow passage giving you access to the burial room, the King's Chamber. And we went inside there, and it's about as big as this room here, but it was completely empty except for this stone sarcophagus at one end here, which was empty of course. There's over 100 pyramids in Egypt, and every one of them the treasure has been stolen centuries ago. The only tomb with the treasure still intact was discovered 100 years ago this year, in 1922, up the Nile River in the Valley of the Kings. Who do you think that was? King Tut, of course, King Tutankhamun, whose golden mask is shown here. The pyramid blocks were chiseled to perfect size with copper tools that had to be constantly sharpened. Then they floated the heavy stones on boats from the quarries hundreds of miles up the Nile River. Using ropes and levers, they dragged the blocks up ramps with sledges on rollers made of logs. This was before the wheel was invented. It's estimated that the Great Pyramid took 20 years to construct, with the labor of 100,000 men who were mostly farmers working during the flood season, and not slaves, as was previously thought. Next to the three pyramids is the Great Sphinx, which dates to 2500 BC, when he was given the face of Khafre, the builder of the middle pyramid, behind it. And he has the body of a crouching lion It was carved out of a single piece of limestone and was covered in sand until about 150 years ago, up to his chin. Here are my fellow college students hanging around the site in this big picture. And in our group portrait on the left in front of the Sphinx, I'm in the very upper left next to our guide, Dr. Izat. And here are a few more photographs I took of the streets of Cairo in 1975. There's a donkey cart, a lot of activity, people going to market. And incidentally, on the upper right is a camel herd going to market because they slaughter them for their meat. And on the bottom left is an overcrowded bus, which were kind of funny to watch. People just jumping onto the windows. And this is the camera I used for 6 months, a Miranda manual single lens reflex using Kodachrome 64 film, which was just invented then, which really is amazing film. Back before digital cameras, before videotape too, by the way. I took about one roll of 24 shots or less per day back then, carefully setting the aperture, shutter speed, and focus, as opposed to in the 2000s when I would take hundreds of automatic digital photos per day. Now let's take a 2-hour flight from Cairo, Egypt, north across the Mediterranean Sea, where we will explore the many wonders of ancient Greece that were built there before Christ BC. Later we will visit sites in Italy, France, and Germany seen here, as well as other places around the world. The oldest structure still standing in Greece is in the ancient city of Mycenae with its Lion's Gate, built in 1200 BC, that I'm standing under here in 2008. Before the invention of the arch by the Romans, the Lion's Gate was constructed as a relieving triangle in order to not break the 20-ton stone lintel above the door. The 2 lion heads were missing today. Here's the other side of the gate from inside Mycenae in 1975. Mycenae is in Greece, in southeast Europe, shown here on the left, and it's on the Peloponnese Peninsula, southwest of the capital of Greece, which is Athens. It's one of the oldest ancient cities, dating back to the Bronze Age, 1600 to 1100 years before Christ. It overlooks a huge valley, as seen here, that was a harbor back then. And here is the walls by the entrance in the middle bottom here. The illustrated map of it shows the placement of the Lion's Gate at the entrance of the citadel and the grave circle beside the pathway up to the king's palace. It's awe-inspiring as you walk up to the gate here and you imagine all the battles that were fought here over the centuries, with soldiers wielding swords and spears to fight their way over the walls. Here we are on the inside under the Lion's Gate. The gigantic stone walls are still in place, fitted precisely with no mortar after more than 3,000 years. Nearby, the treasury of Epidaurus is the oldest precursor to the dome, built in 1300 BC. It's an early attempt at creating a spacious room with stone walls rising up to a single point, creating a high ceiling over a large room. Then I'm standing in the top photo. And just inside the gate, I'm standing in the famous grave circle of Mycenae. Mycenae is the ancient city from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The ruins of the city were excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, and here on the left you can see the grave circle or cemetery for the kings. Deep down the 40-foot grave shaft, he found this mask of gold, which he thought was the mask of Agamemnon, but has been later disproven. They also found many priceless treasures of gold jewelry and necklaces such as these, but most of the buildings were destroyed centuries ago. Homer was the blind poet who told his stories in poetic verse, which was written down as the oldest book besides the Bible. You can see it in many movies, including Troy with Brad Pitt. Near Mycenae is another ancient city, Epidaurus, which was occupied for hundreds of years during the entire Greek and Roman eras. It's a World Heritage Site, which was a sanctuary of healing dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, and included a hospital, baths, temples, and schools, kind of like an ancient Mayo Clinic. It's especially known for its amazing theater, the most well-preserved in the ancient world. Built in 340 BC, it was in use until the end of the Roman Empire, and it's so well-preserved because for 1,400 years, until it was excavated in the 1880s, it was buried by dirt. It's known for having perfect acoustics, which visitors witness when they stand on the stage and whisper, and your friend can hear you from the very top. We tested it, and it worked great, amazing. Many church groups on tour record their singing here, as you see in the bottom right, and it features modern productions playing to 12,000 people in the audience every summer, like on the bottom left. Our next stop is the original site of the Olympics, where athletic contests were held every 4 years for over 1,000 years. Much of it was destroyed by earthquakes, and here we are amongst the broken columns in 1975. Olympia is located in western Greece on the Peloponnese again. Here is what Olympia used to look like with numerous classical buildings and the stadium in this graphical map. The Olympics were started here in 776 BC and lasted until about 400 AD. And athletes competed every 4 years from throughout the region in many different sports. The modern Olympics were then restarted in Athens in 1896 and have been expanded worldwide ever since. The Temple of Hera, Zeus's wife, is where the Olympic flame is lit, shown here, and taken by runners around the world wherever the games are being held today. They competed with wrestling, decathlons, javelin, shot put, long jump, and many foot races. This archway led into the stadium where only the male athletes competed, in the nude, by the way. We recorded us running a 440 there with our 16 millimeter film camera. No sound before videotape. And then much later we recorded with iPhones, my students and I racing in 2008, shown in the bottom left. This is where another one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was, the Temple of Zeus, which housed the massive golden statue to the king of the gods. Today the statue is gone and there are only 2 columns standing as they have been toppled in earthquakes, like this one lying here where you can see how they were built by stacking stone discs one on top of each other. Next we take a 4-hour bus ride to Delphi, the most sacred site of the ancient Greeks. Here is the iconic sanctuary of Athena, the Tholos, or round temple, to the goddess of wisdom, Athena. I wasn't supposed to climb on the stones, but no one was there, and I was 20 years old. Here I am again in 2003. Delphi was an ancient religious sanctuary located on the mainland about 3 hours northwest of Athens. As you can see in this map, it was a series of temples, a theater, a treasury, and a stadium built on a mountainside. It was inhabited for 500 years from 800 BC to 300 BC. And here's the famous bronze statue of a charioteer with glass inlaid eyes, unearthed there 100 years ago. And here I am in 2003 above the Temple of Apollo in Delphi in the magnificent valley below. You start at the bottom and walk up the sacred way to the Temple of Apollo, dedicated to the god of sun, music, and prophecy. After the priests interpreted what the oracle said and then sacrificed a goat on the altar of the temple, which only has a few Doric columns still standing today. But here's how it once looked in the bottom right. On the left is a view from above the theater down towards the Temple of Apollo. A little farther up, you reach the theater built into the hillside, which hosted hundreds of performances over the centuries. Here's how it looked in 400 BC and today, and our guide describing its history to my students. It was the home to the Oracle of Delphi, the priestess who was famous throughout the ancient world for predicting the future. She was consulted before all major undertakings like a war or a royal marriage, and she expressed her visions after breathing the fumes emanating from the mountain spring and going into a trance. We're posing here by the spring on the mountainside. And in the middle is the Omphalos of Delphi, an ancient stone that they believed was set there by Zeus as the navel of the earth. At the top of the sacred way, there is a very well-preserved ancient stadium. It once held 6,000 spectators when the Pantheon Games were held every 2 years before and after the Olympic Games. Our tradition here was to film us wrestling in the stadium in 1975 and in 2003. You can see me here victorious. My students really got into it and slightly injured themselves a little bit as they wrestled. Here is a painting of how it might have looked 2,500 years ago. And now let's go to Athens and the Acropolis, the crown jewel, which I think should have been one of the 7 ancient wonders. The Parthenon is the main temple on the Acropolis dedicated to Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom and war. Here I am in 2003 and in 2007 with restoration cranes used for repairing the marble, especially before the 2004 Olympics in Athens. Located in the heart of Athens, the capital of Greece, today almost 4 million people living around it, about the same size as Minneapolis. Here's the map of Athens. You can see the Acropolis on the left and the Parliament in the center, the government center of Greece, and Mount Lycabettos, where I lived for 4 months, on the right. Here's how it looked during the golden age of Greece from 460 BC to 430 BC. And here's my photo of it showing how it was built on a high promontory in the center of Athens. Thus the name Acropolis, which means high city. And on the far right, here we're marching down the street with the Greek soldiers, also called Evzonans. The Golden Age was under the leadership of Pericles when Athens created the voting system called democracy. Here's what the Parthenon looked like when it was built by Pericles during the Golden Age of Greece in the upper left. It's 230 feet long and 100 feet wide with marble sculptured friezes above the 40-foot tall Doric columns. And they were all painted beautiful colors at the time. On the right are the ruins as they look today. I took my college course on the Acropolis, and I'm in this bottom left picture, I'm in the white pants on the Parthenon here, listening to a lecture by my professor on the left. The Parthenon is considered the most perfect building of antiquity with precise dimensions and perspective. It's been a Christian church and a Muslim mosque through the centuries and was partially pulverized by an explosion in the 1600s. Here's the east side of the Parthenon where my students are learning how this temple has influenced so many other buildings, like the Lincoln Monument, for example, with its Doric columns holding up the timber roof before arches and domes were invented. It had a 30-foot gilded statue to the goddess Athena inside it. And on the right, in 1975, my friends and I posed where the statue stood, but it has been illegal to walk on the Parthenon since the 1980s. From the entrance called the Propylaea, top left, you can look behind you at the Agora, the central marketplace of Athens, in the bottom left picture. And in the distance you see the Hephaestion, this other beautiful temple in it. Next to the Parthenon is the Erechtheion on the upper right here, which is an Ionic temple with the famous caryatids, which are columns in the shape of maidens. Above the Acropolis is the older theater to Dionysus, the god of wine and pleasure, built around 500 BC, shown in the bottom left. And looking down from the southwest side is the Roman theater of Herodotus Atticus, which was built much later in 161 AD, in the picture in the top and the bottom right. It's still used for theater and musical performances today. In fact, Yanni from Minneapolis recorded a famous album there. You can see both of those theaters on this map of the Acropolis. From the Acropolis, you can also look down on the temple of Olympian Zeus, which is 5 centuries younger than the Acropolis. It was built by Roman Emperor Hadrian in 132 AD and features Corinthian columns 60 feet tall. Only 15 of the original 104 columns are standing today, and you can see one of them tipped over in a windstorm in the 1890s. Here is the Acropolis and Parthenon at night, with Mount Lycabettos in the distance. It's the highest point in Athens, and the neighborhood that we lived in while going to college is called Kolonaki, and it was right on the foothills of Mount Lycabettos. So we would go up there and look out over the city. This is my photo from the top of our apartment looking back at the Acropolis in the upper right with TV antennas at the time. And at the bottom is me standing on the Acropolis looking at Mount Lycabettos in 1975, 2003, and 2008. I always recommend for the first thing to do in Athens is to climb to the top of Mount Lycabettos, where there's a restaurant, and take in this magnificent view of Athens all around you with the Mediterranean Sea in the distance. You can see the Acropolis and the Parthenon and the Parliament building, and on the right you see a night view, a couple of night views of it. The island of Rhodes is where the third ancient wonder of the world was situated for a few hundred years. The Colossus of Rhodes straddled the harbor, 108 feet tall, made of bronze as illustrated here. Built in 296 BC, it fell in an earthquake about 70 years later. And centuries later, all the bronze was melted down to make bronze weapons by the Muslims. Today there are 2 deer statues on pedestals in its place, as you see in my pictures here. Rhodes is one of the most popular Greek islands with ancient and medieval historical sites on it, as well as many picturesque beaches like this one at Lindos, you see on the right. Here we are posing there in 1975. On the hill in the background is an ancient Acropolis from the 400s BC that I'm climbing on here in the middle. And you can see on the map of Lindos, of Rhodes, that Lindos is about an hour south of the main harbor town of Rhodes that most of the ferries dock at. I often say the most fun I've ever had was riding motorcycles to Lindos on Rhodes. Cost $20 a day, gas included. And here are some scenes from our 16 millimeter film of it on the left. And on the right, I'm riding a donkey for about 20 euros to go up to the castle from the town of Lindos in 2003. In the middle, we're sitting on the barricade walls at the entrance to the castle of St. John's Knights on top of the hill. The famous Acropolis of Lindos is truly unique because, as you can see here, it started with a Greek temple which dates back to 400 BC, shown in the upper right, and surrounding it is a medieval castle built by the Knights Templar on their way to the Holy Land during the Crusades around 1300 AD. With the entrance gate where many battles were fought throughout the centuries shown on the lower right. One stupid thing that I did when I was 20 years old is to stand outside the stone wall on the edge of the cliff and pretend that I was going to dive into the water 200 feet below just for the picture. Fortunately, I didn't slip and end my life then. So when we went back to Lindos here 50 years, when I was 50 years old, I wisely stood behind the wall for the same picture. The view from up there is of St. Paul's Bay, named for the apostle who stayed here in 43 AD on his way to Rome, bringing the teachings of Christianity with him. The main harbor of Rhodes also has a crusader castle from 1300s AD and a wall around the city that you can walk along the top of around the city. It's attached to the castle of the St. John Knights, as you can see in this map. Here is the wall along the harbor and the entrance to the castle. And one of my students with a pile of huge cannonballs that were stored there 700 years ago. This is an artist's depiction of the fourth ancient wonder of the world that I visited. This is the Lighthouse of Alexandria. It was 400 feet tall. For many centuries, the tallest man-made structure, with a mirror on top for the daytime and bonfires to guide the ships at night. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was located at the mouth of the Nile River in Egypt. Built in 280 BC by Ptolemy, it guided sailors into the harbor of the Nile, the longest river in the world. It lasted for 1,500 years until 1323 AD, when it was finally destroyed by a series of earthquakes. Another great wonder located here was the enormous ancient library, which unfortunately was lost in a fire 2,000 years ago. This is what the lighthouse ruins look like today, but not very impressive in the upper left. So instead, we had a really fun day there swimming in the Mediterranean Sea on the beach nearby. In Alexandria, the local Egyptians were fascinated by our classmates in bikinis instead of burqas. So we gave the girls fake rings and told the locals that we were married so they wouldn't bother us anymore. Here's another photo on the Mediterranean Sea later in Spain on my tour of Europe with the Rock of Gibraltar in the distance. Oh, to be that skinny again. Now we jump over to China to see a present-day ancient wonder on the other side of the world. This spectacular, this buried terracotta army of Xian. 8,000 terracotta warriors and horses made of fired clay were buried here for the emperor's afterlife over 2,000 years ago. These are two of my students when we first came upon the pit number 1 where most of the soldiers are buried. The terracotta soldiers are in Xian, Xian, the ancient capital in the center of China, at the end of the Silk Road, which went all the way to the Roman Empire in Europe. The terracotta army was built from 247 BC to 208 BC, over 2,200 years ago. 3,000 soldiers have been reconstructed since its discovery in 1974, and that's so far out of an estimated 8,000 more yet to be recovered. And here you see the painted face of one of them in the middle. The army was built on orders from Shi Huangdi, the great unifier of China and the namesake of China, who died in 210 BCE. He also started the Great Wall, by the way, which we'll explore next. The map of the site shows his tomb, a huge mound surrounded by the pits full of his buried army for the afterlife. It is believed to be full of untold treasures and a river of mercury, as in this illustration above. He died at the age of 39, probably by ingesting mercury, which he believed would help him live forever. Apparently not. But in a way, he was immortal because of this great archaeological treasure. This is the biggest pit, number 1, in the Terracotta Soldier Museum, with 4,000 infantrymen standing in good order. There are 4 pits dug with hundreds of chariots and horses, but most of them are still buried in the pits since the wooden roofs caved in over the centuries. Here are some of the finished soldiers after reconstruction. Even more amazing is the fact that each man's face, hair, and clothing is unique. There is a photo display showing hundreds of their different faces of the 8,000 soldiers that haven't been able to find. They have not been able to find an identical twin copy yet. Above are the preservation teams working on the soldiers as they are excavated from the site. Since 2009, many soldiers with painted faces have been discovered. And here are some of the unfinished soldiers and horses as they carefully are being assembled on the bottom right. This wonder was discovered by this man, Yang Zifa, in 1974 in the bottom left. He and some friends were drilling a well 25 miles east of Xian when his hoe struck something hard, and he found a pottery figurine which led to all the life-size soldiers. Here he's hiding with his fan because he thought I might flash him with my camera. He happens to be going blind from flashes as he signs books hundreds of times a day for a living, for his celebrity. Here you can see charioteers with their horses leading the troops. Their reins and their wooden carts are long gone, but the terracotta clay and bronze arrow tips remain behind. Pit number 3 is shown here with its high-ranking officers and a war chariot. It was the command post of the army. Thousands of bronze armaments survived, including arrows, crossbows, swords, axes, etc. Most of the wood of bows and arrows were decomposed with this famous archer here. Altogether, 160 kneeling archers were found in pit number 2. There were 2 bronze chariots and horses created at half scale and unearthed here in 1980. They are masterpieces of bronzeware depicting perfect horses, driver, reins, wheels, and a parasol for the emperor. They were in many broken pieces when found, and so it took 5 years to restore them. Now let's go to the Great Wall, the world's largest man-made structure, which is almost 4,000 miles long. Stretched out, it would be the length of the United States. It attracts about 10 million visitors per year, and here you can see the sign for the upcoming Beijing Olympics, which were to be held in the summer of 2008, when we were there in March of 2007. It says, "One world, one dream." Stretching the 4,000 miles between the Himalayas in the west to the East China Sea, it is really an amazing sight. On this map, you can see where we chose to climb up to the right towards the east. And here are the first 2 towers in these pictures. It was built between 220 BC and the 1600s AD to protect the Chinese from raiders on horseback with bows and arrows attacking from the north. It was started by the first emperor Xian, who united China and buried the terracotta soldiers. But much of what we see now was built during the Ming Dynasty in the 1400s to protect against the Mongols. Here's our group after we got off the bus in Badaling, which is the name of this section of the wall, with our little Timberwolf mascot puppy. Here is the ticket office. As you see, the tickets cost 40 CNY, or Chinese yuan, which is about $6.40. Not too bad. As we climb the steep steps higher and higher, we look back at this breathtaking view and can see our buses and the wall continuing along the ridge forever. Notice that it wasn't built along the flat plains, which would have been much easier. The really incredible fact is that it was built along the mountain ridges to take advantage of the natural steep slopes to shoot down on their enemies. And there are only slots in the wall called crenulations on the north side, because that's where the Mongols were coming. They could shoot down through the slots at them. You can see here how steep it gets, and yours truly was puffing pretty hard after going through the 3 towers. Just 3 towers, which are every 500 yards or so, where they would light signal fires to transfer messages from one end of the empire to the other. Most of it is 50 feet high and 30 feet wide, enough for 2 horsemen to ride along the top of it. And here is how it was laboriously made by the hard labor of millions of peasants and prisoners. It's sometimes called the longest graveyard in the world because of all the laborers who died and were buried beneath it. This is where many famous people, including U.S. presidents from Nixon to Bush to Obama, have visited. My students challenged me to dance on the Great Wall, so of course I had to do it. And they all laughed at me. Now let's fly back over to Southern Europe and explore the wonders of Italy's capital city, Rome. Here we are on day one in 2003 in front of the Colosseum and the Arch of Constantine with my students here. Rome is located close to the western coast of Italy on the Tiber River, just before it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. The vast Roman Empire spread throughout Europe and North Africa to the Middle East, and it lasted about 1,000 years, from 510 BC to 476 AD. Here I am being arrested by Roman centurions by the Colosseum for fun. You pay them $1 and they do that. And a picture of the Roman Colosseum at night. The ancient wonders of Rome include the Colosseum, the Forum, Circus Maximus, and the Pantheon. The stone Colosseum was constructed by Emperor Vespasian from 70 to 80 AD, and it entertained the masses for 400 years afterwards. In America, of course, we never see anything older than 300 years old, so it's quite awe-inspiring when you're walking down the modern streets with cars and you see a 150-foot tall building in the distance that's 2,000 years old. Like in this photo I took in 1975 when I first saw it. And here's an aerial photo of the Colosseum showing the ancient Forum next door to it. Also called the Flavian Amphitheater, it held 70,000 people, about the same as U.S. Bank Stadium. Here's an illustration of how it looked in the first century when it held hundreds of spectators, where thousands of gladiators and animals would fight to the death. Thousands of Christians were martyred here by the emperor who made it illegal to worship anyone but him. I was fortunate to have toured Rome in 1975 and 2003 and then twice in 2005 with my students, and then my family shown here on the outside and on the inside. My wife and 3 sons. Since the stadium floor is removed, you can walk across the bridge and look down where the cells held the animals and gladiators, and they would rise up on elevators into the center of the arena. The floor and most of the seats were pillaged by the barbarians, but you can imagine the cheers of the crowd when the gladiators fought to the death, as in this scene from the movie Gladiator. In 312 AD, Christianity was adopted in the Roman Empire by Emperor Constantine. So this Arch of Constantine next to the Colosseum commemorates the important event when Constantine saw a vision of a cross before a crucial battle that he won, and thus made Christianity legal throughout the Roman Empire, and thus Europe. From here starts the Appian Way, or road throughout the empire. As you enter the Forum, you walk through the Arch of Titus in the bottom left here, commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem by him in 80 AD. The Roman Forum, the ancient city, which for almost 1,000 years was the seat of government for the empire and the emperor's palace. In the upper left is the Temple of Saturn, among the earliest around 500 BC, and the Arch of Septimus Severus next to it, built around 200 AD. From the emperor's palace balcony, you can look down on the Forum, which was destroyed by the barbarians around 500 AD, It includes the ruins of temples, basilicas, libraries, arches, and the Senate building. Here's an illustration of what the Roman Forum looked like at its height around 200 AD. Next to the Forum is the Circus Maximus, as you can see on this map, the first and largest stadium in the Roman Empire that could accommodate over 150,000 spectators. It's famous for the chariot racing that you probably remember in the movie Ben-Hur. Today it's just a beautiful city park where my boys are flexing their gladiator muscles. My favorite wonder of Rome is the Pantheon, the most beautiful and influential building in the world. The Pantheon, originally built by Marcus Agrippa in 14 AD, you can see his name above the door. It was a temple to all the gods. Pantheon means many gods, and also was the very first dome. It has been a Catholic church since the 600s AD, which is why it's the most well-preserved ancient building in Rome. It has a historic rotunda shape with a domed ceiling, later influencing St. Peter's Cathedral and our U.S. Capitol and Jefferson Memorial. Here it is in the 1700s and today inside. 200 years ago, it was the first large dome space held up by a ceiling made with revolutionary engineering. And it has a hole in the roof where you can stand in the rain inside sometimes. It has a huge 24-foot tall bronze doors to enter, as you can see in the lower picture here, with my boys standing next to them. And in this picture you can see the hole in the roof called an oculus. On sunny days, a circular spotlight follows the movement of the sun around the cavernous marble room. As you step inside, you hear the echoes of the marble tombs along the walls, where many dignitaries are interred. There's a 300-year-old Baroque fountain outside with grotesque faces that my boys are mimicking here. One of the hundreds of freshwater fountains still running throughout Rome. They are especially beautiful at night.